our WeSpeak series that was kind of designed in kind of recognition of the 50th anniversary of coeducation at Mercersburg. And, it was originally planned to be around on-campus activities with our current students, but this allowed us to pivot and think differently. And so really just trying to create dialogue and to have discussions about issues now that are kind of connected to gender equity and really equity in general. And so I appreciate you guys being so willing to come out and take a risk as we go on, and to discuss things that are really new for just about all of us. My name is Jason Brashatsky. I'm the director of alumni relations at Mercersburg Academy. This is actually my 23rd year at Mercersburg. Prior, I taught math here for 18 years, and this is my 5th year in this new position. I'm really appreciative of how this position gives me the opportunity to kind of connect with past students, connect with alumni, to meet some people that I hadn't met before, and more importantly, kind of bring everyone together and try to find ways to both celebrate Mercersburg and also celebrate the great work that our alumni are doing. I'm especially appreciative of Robert coming in and spending some time with us. And Robert, he also has a little bit of an unusual path. Robert was a one-year student at Mercersburg. He came from Heidelberg, and he spent his 11th grade year at Mercersburg. While he was at Mercersburg, he played soccer and tennis and ran indoor track. And he remembers being impacted by a school talk given by faculty member Ray Larson, who talked about his time as a Peace Corps volunteer. And Robert recognizes that talk as kind of one of the things that kind of led him to thinking about a career in international development. After finishing high school, he went back to Germany after Mercersburg. He graduated second in his class, and he spent a year in Ghana as a volunteer with the German Development Service. He began his university study in Heidelberg, where he earned a bachelor's degree in psychology, then a joint master's program in peace and conflict studies from Marburg University in Germany and University of Kent in England. He stayed at the University of Kent to earn his PhD in international conflict analysis. His research at Kent was focused on gender equality, sexual violence, and conflict resolution processes. Robert's research is published or is forthcoming in the Journal of Conflict Resolution and the Journal of Peace Research. He won the 2019 Cedric Smith Prize for the Best Peace and Conflict Studies paper by a UK or ROI-based PhD student and the International Studies Association 2020 Dina Zins Award. He's currently a postdoc researcher at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. He lives with his wife, Liz, in Northern Virginia. We will be recording this session to make it available for people that are not able to make it. Best practices usually are to mute the microphone when you're not being called on, but at least for the beginning of this, Robert and I were talking that I think especially with discussions, especially discussions like this, it's sometimes helpful to kind of know names or be able to put some, what brought you here type conversations with you. And so I'm just going to, before I completely hand it over to Robert, give you a second to kind of say your name and your kind of quick story, and then we'll hand it over to Robert. And I'll also make sure that in my kind of follow-up for this, I will include Robert's contact information if there are any questions that you have that you like to reach out to him. But Nevi, why don't we start with you and let you introduce yourself here?
Hi, I'm Nevi. I'm Mercersburg class of 2019, and I go to Lehigh University, and I'm studying public health and humanitarian law. And I was really drawn to this experience because I've been spending quite a bit of time at the UN through my experience at Lehigh because they have a very close connection. And I'm very interested in like gender studies and women leadership. So I'm excited to hear from you today. Thank you.
Jeff?
Mr. Cohen.
Jeff, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Coming to you from the comfort of my home in Main Hall. I'm not going to say that I have, wholesale interest in any particular aspect of this talk more than other talks, but I'm here because of Robert, whom I taught and whom I'm a big fan of. And I'm just curious to hear what he has to say, and looking forward to it. So pretty much that's all I have. I don't have any other kind of like fun anecdotes or impressive things to tell you. I can just tell you that I'm excited to hear what he's gonna have to say.
Thanks. Margaret, why don't you go ahead?
Margaret O'Brien, class of '86. And when the agenda came out, the opportunities to call in, this fit my schedule. And I really remember some of the Friday school meetings from my days as a student. And at my last reunion, I attended the two speakers. Both were very memorable. One in particular about the loss of free press throughout the world has been, I bring it up in conversation frequently. So I'm like, this is just a great opportunity to hear about something that's outside of my daily life.
Kat, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I'm Kat Smith. I'm the class of 2007, so right around Robert's time. I'm an anthropologist, politics and anthropology and culture and people, especially right now, just given the current climate. It's a whole big mix of all of my interests and all of my passions in one life. There's not much going on, so perfect timing. And yeah, glad to be here.
And I know you gave us a little bit, Nazanin, but maybe you can give us a little bit more here.
Sure. Yeah, so as I said, I'm Whitney Peza's sister-in-law, and my brother Amir, her husband, actually went to Lehigh, so it's funny to see all these connections here. So I'm based at Deakin University in Australia, at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership, and I mainly do research on humanitarian aid in North Korea, but also engaging in looking at leadership in the humanitarian sector, and particularly looking at women and the gap in women in leadership roles within the humanitarian system. And I teach on 2 master's courses, one in humanitarian assistance and one in sustainable development and humanitarian assistance. And a couple days ago, we did a class on peacekeeping, and then this ended up in my inbox, and I thought, perfect timing. This is a great opportunity to hear some thoughts that are kind of bringing all these interests together.
And Evan, we're just giving kind of a quick word about what brought us in here a little bit, and then we'll hand it over to Robert.
So my name's Evan Moats. I'm class of 2012, and I'm lucky enough to work alongside Jason in the Alumni and Advancement Office, as well as the Admissions Office. So this is one that was particularly interesting for me. I was a mostly cultural and environmental geography studies major in school, so with a dual international relations degree. So it was a lot that interested me that I thought, so I thought I'd jump in.
And I usually save my thank you for Denise for the end, but Denise, why don't you, Denise is also from our office, and will be kind of acting as the host, and certainly looking forward to, Denise, do you want to say hi real quick? And
hi guys, I look forward to this. It'll be great.
Yeah. And so, again, feel free to use the chat window. I'm sure Robert will be watching a little bit, and if there are issues that come up quickly, I'll be watching the chat as well. but Robert's going to kind of speak about his work and kind of the history of his work a little bit, and then we'd love to be able to kind of open it up and see if there are any questions. So thanks again for being here, and a special thank you to Robert. Go ahead.
Well, let me say thank you first, because this is great. I usually don't get to talk to people outside of my work about my work. It's usually, I remember a couple of years ago when we were still living up near Boston, we had friends over and they were like, what does Robert do again? Because it was like rape and sexual violence and war. And so people tend to be a little put off by that. So now you give me a platform. This is great. So considering the sort of different backgrounds, I'm going to give you just a little bit of history background about the United Nations and peacekeeping in general, kind of start there, and then transition to specifically women in peacekeeping. So the UN obviously was founded in 1948, and that's also the same year the first mission of military observers was sent out, and that was to Palestine. A year later, the second mission was India-Pakistan, and that is still active to this day. It's the longest serving mission, kind of policing the border between India and Pakistan. And there have been so far over 70 missions in total. And currently there are 13 missions active. Amongst them, some that have been going on for quite a while, such as the mentioned the one in India and Pakistan. Some more recent, such as Mali and the Central African Republic. Others include Cyprus and Lebanon, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. I was supposed to go to the two missions in the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo later this year, but because of the global pandemic, no one's going anywhere. And the UN in particular is very careful about letting anyone in, because they've had issues of, specifically in Haiti, a UN mission and a contingent of Nepalese peacekeepers was responsible for a cholera outbreak following the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. And therefore the UN is particularly wary of being...
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. But now you're muted, but it wasn't me. So in Haiti, the Nepalese contingent was responsible for cholera, and therefore, obviously, all UN personnel right now has to be super careful about spreading COVID. There's already a lot of sort of suspicion and xenophobia that UN missions often have to deal with in the different host countries. So in this particularly stressful time, it's all the more important that basically the number of outsiders are limited. So the key tasks of peacekeeping missions are basically, there are, I'd say, 5 key tasks. One is conflict mitigation and prevention. So reducing combat between the warring factions, that's either between 2 countries, right, India and Pakistan, or more often in the last 30 years, it's in civil wars. So a government facing a rebel group or multiple rebel groups. So conflict prevention mitigation is a key part of that. The protection of civilians is another key pillar of UN missions. The monitoring and implementing of agreements between the government and rebel groups, the promotion of human rights, the promotion of what is called women, peace, and security, which is a specific agenda that I'll talk about a bit more, and then generally supporting the host state and the host government in its basic government functions, because UN missions are usually deployed to what is often termed fragile states. So governments that are either not in complete control of their territory or are unable to fulfill basic government functions. So with that sort of background on UN missions and peacekeeping missions in general sort of laid out, a closer look at women in peacekeeping. One key date is the year 2000, when the Security Council, which is the UN body that sort of makes all the important decisions for peacekeeping operations, for any sort of thing related to security and conflict. Everything that goes through that and has any sort of meaning is sort of in a resolution. So in 2000, the UN Security Council passed a resolution 1325, also known as the Women, Peace and Security resolution. And basically, for the first time, laid out in very clear terms that something that is very obvious to anyone who really thinks about it, that women should have an equal participation in all aspects of peace building, conflict prevention, recovery and relief work. And so it's the Women, Peace and Security agenda, recognizing women's responsibility and role in all matters of peace and conflict. So that's a pivotal moment and an important resolution that has a number of follow-on resolutions that sort of detail particular issue areas. 2 or 3 specifically deal with conflict-related sexual violence, which then led to criticism that the UN was focusing too much on women as victims and not enough as women as agents. And another criticism that was put forward in terms of the Women, Peace and Security agenda was that it sort of shoehorned women into the role of peacemakers and sort of had an essentializing gender view of women as inherently more peaceful. So as you can already tell by these sort of brief remarks, despite the sort of positive ideals of the founding resolution, the UN has struggled with implementing it, has struggled with sort of shaping it in an inclusive and comprehensive way. Going a little more into the day-to-day peacekeeping operations and women's role in these. In 2007, we have the first all-female police unit deployed in Liberia as part of that mission. So that's 7 years after the resolution. So it took, again, a long time. In 2014, we then have the first woman to serve as a force commander, and that's for the peacekeeping operation in Cyprus, and that's Major General Kristen Lund. And then just last year, the Cyprus mission, again, was the first mission to have women in charge of the military, the police, and the civilian staff. So all 3 major components of the mission were for the first time headed by a woman. So that's where we are in 2019. And to sort of give you a more of a statistical background in terms of the numbers, so as mentioned, we have sort of the military, the police, and the civilian component. And the military component of peacekeeping missions is further split into the purely military contingents. So those are battalions that are going out on patrols, completing military tasks. And then there are military observers who aren't allowed to engage in active hostilities. So they're really just there for monitoring and reporting. And then we have police officers, formed police units, which are slightly different, and the civilian component of missions. The formed police units are specifically trained and equipped police units that are sent to high-risk environments. and there are usually 140 individual officers make up one formed police unit. The key difference is really the training and the equipment and what they're capable of. So really meant for the high risk environments. If we look at those 4 components, military contingents, military observers, police officers, and police units, what do you think is the average number of women? Like, what's the percentage of women in these different different parts? Anyone want to take a guess for any of the 4?
Less than 10%.
For which one? For all of them?
I didn't hear all 4, I'm sorry, but I would just say generally less than 10%.
Okay, generally less than 10%. Jeff, you said 15 in general, or for all of them across the board?
Yeah, I don't know what about a general. Just saying a general number. I don't know enough.
Okay. So the good news is it's not always less than 10%. So there's a clear difference between the different positions. So for police officers, for individual police officers, if we look at all missions, currently 26.8% are women. For the formed police units, it's 10.8% women. For military observers, it's 16.7% women. But for military personnel, so the actual soldiers, it's only 4.7%. So there's a clear difference, and you could definitely make the case there's a clear gender difference in terms of what these roles entail and where women get to serve, are allowed to serve. So the UN, despite or because of these numbers, has made a real push over the last 20, well, I don't want to say a real push, but has made a push over the last 10 to 20 years to increase the number of women. And a lot of it sort of is under the argument, under this disguise of women make peacekeeping missions more effective. And the arguments sort of boil down to 11 key points that I'll kind of go through. And then I'll go through why it's problematic to make that argument. And arguably, we don't know if it's actually true. And just to put it out right up front, the argument that should be made is a normative one, and that is being made particularly by more feminist scholars, that, you know, it is everyone's right and therefore women's equal right to participate in peacekeeping missions, the same as men. So the normative argument is very clear, very simple. But unfortunately, policymakers and decision makers in the UN in particular are not as receptive to that argument, and feel like they always have to make an argument based around effectiveness. And so the arguments around effectiveness kind of go to, are based on anecdotal evidence from certain missions where we had female peacekeepers, and it's based on their sort of experiences, their reports, and their successes. The problem is it's always just sort of anecdotal. It's limited to 2 or 3 missions, and we can't really draw general inferences from that. So one of the key arguments is that women are able to access social spaces that men aren't able to access, and therefore they can communicate and gather intelligence from local populations that enhances mission effectiveness and efficiency prevents outbreaks by sort of gathering information and intelligence about potential uprisings, potential mobilization. The other argument, another argument is about physically accessing women in the local population, so body searches when you have security concerns in public venues and so on. Along with that, screening of female combatants when you have disarmament and demobilization processes. So when rebel groups turn in their weapons and sort of say, okay, we're demobilizing, we're coming back into the fold of society, then the screening of female combatants can be performed arguably better by female peacekeepers. Another argument put forward is about improved trust, that local populations, when they interact with female peacekeepers and female police officers in particular, it increases trust in the police as an institution and state institutions more broadly, because they are perceived as more fair and less corrupt, which again is rooted in gender stereotypes. And so, as I already sort of previewed, a lot of these kind of arguments about women's effectiveness draw on a very essentialized gender view. Another aspect that, or another argument made in favor of women's participation and surrounding effectiveness is that the one female formed police unit in Liberia was supposedly responsible for a reduction in sexual and gender-based violence. And that again comes back to sort of a gender essentialized view of SGBV affects primarily women, and therefore women are also more equipped to deal with it. That's sort of the logic behind it. And in line with that, there's also the argument that women encourage women to come forward. So if you have women serving as police officers, local women might be more comfortable reporting certain events and incidents of violence to them. I already mentioned sort of the communication and intelligence gathering aspect. One further point is surrounding sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers, which is a huge issue. And basically, since 1993, when it was first reported in the UN mission in Cambodia, there have been reports of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers in every single UN mission. The sort of level and how expansive that is varies obviously from mission to mission, but there have been reports of that on every single mission. And there's a recent book that I have here next to me that sort of talks about that in depth. It's called Violating Peace, Sex, Aid, and Peacekeeping. It's really good. So if you're interested in that, I just wanted to highlight that. And the argument in favor of women's participation in peacekeeping is basically in relation to sexual exploitation and abuse, is that they don't do that, and they have a civilizing effect on other men serving in the mission. Therefore, they make the mission more effective. And lastly, there's an argument made about, again, going back to the Liberia example of the women in the peacekeeping mission serving as role models for local women. And there actually is some evidence to support that. In 9 years during the mission, the number of women in the Liberian police increased from 6% to 17%, which is a substantial increase. I'm not sure to what extent we can solely attribute that to, the role model effect, but there definitely was an international push and support for increasing women's participation in the Liberian police. So with these arguments in favor of women's participation, linked to effectiveness sort of laid out, I've already gotten into some of the caveats. The most important one, right, that it's often rooted in an essentialized view of gender that equates women with an inherent peacefulness, and sort of says men are inherently violent and aggressive and women aren't, and therefore if we include more women in peacekeeping, that will also be better. As a man, I also take offense to that. So the essentialized gender view cuts both ways. And with the numbers of women that I mentioned, remember it's not even 5% of women in the military missions. The expectation that women turn the ship around, making up such a small minority, is just crazy. It's just a ridiculous notion that that small minority can change the militarized masculine culture that pervades militaries in general, but also peacekeeping missions. In addition to that, the women themselves, female peacekeepers, often have to fend off sexual harassment themselves. So to then further expect them to go out there and reduce the number of incidents in the context and also police their colleagues is, it's just an unrealistic expectation, again. And tied to that is the other issue of we're assuming that with the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse, that there's a loyalty to other women that trumps the loyalty to their colleagues, potentially from their own contingent, or at least within the mission. So we're asking women to choose to to show solidarity with other women rather than the people that they serve with every day, that they depend on for their own safety. And that's, again, a huge ask and a sort of unrealistic expectation. And that's basically why these caveats are basically why it's an unequal burden on women to expect them to increase effectiveness and make peacekeeping operations better. Because they're expected to outperform men while facing a multitude of barriers and being a small minority in the context of the mission. And so it's crazy to think that women are in a position to compensate for the surplus deficit that the men create. Or as a friend who also works on this, works in the field, recently said in a Zoom chat, women aren't unicorns. We can't expect miraculous things from them. So that's kind of my summary talk for now. And I kind of want to open it up to questions from you. I can go into more detail about certain things. I can talk a bit more about my own project. And before I do that, one other book I wanted to kind of highlight, a friend and scholarly hero of mine, Sabrina Karim and Kyle Birdsley, have written this book on equal opportunity peacekeeping. It's really fantastic if you're interested in that kind of stuff. They talk a lot about the Liberian case, which I mentioned a few times. So yeah, just wanted to highlight that as well.
Thanks, Robert. Sorry, but I've, was interested when you were, well, how come it's not as simple as saying how many peacekeeping missions are successful and how many of those successful ones have women that are involved or women that are in leadership of that? It seemed when you were giving the advantages of having women, including the more women in the police force in Liberia, in Liberia, like, what if that's not what the mission was? I mean, is it not that simple? Is that what the problem is? But it seems like the metric that you didn't discuss is as simple as peacekeeping missions with women are more successful, less successful, or doesn't seem to be connected.
Yeah, that's a great question. The key issue there is we can't even agree what a successful UN mission is. It's because it's really, really hard. I mean, we all sort of, the evidence is very clear in terms of what missions do well. So it's one of the most robust findings in sort of the international relations, political science research that UN missions reduce violence, in particular lethal violence. So fewer civilians and fewer combatant deaths when peacekeeping missions are deployed. But is that enough to say the mission is successful? Arguably not, because of all the other things that they're supposed to do, right? From promotion of human rights to supporting the state to, the women, peace and security agenda. So a successful mission might leave a country and because it's successful, and then the country relapses into civil war again. So was the mission actually successful or not? So there's also that sort of temporal aspect of determining success. And then in regards to the issue of looking at the number of women in the mission, it's not as simple as that. Because of the small number of women, it's the 4.7% in the military is across 13 missions, right? So if you break that down, Jeff, you're the math teacher, that's a tiny percentage, right? For each individual mission in terms of assuming that it's equally distributed, which it probably isn't. And then the other issue is that you have rotations, right? So one contingent from, let's say, Ghana might be deployed to the Central African Republic for 6 months, and they might have a gender equal battalion, saying it's 50-50, but they're only deployed for 6 months, and then they're replaced by another contingent that might be all male. So, and then after 6 months, you have, so that's a full year. And then in the year, we saw a reduction of violence from, within the 12-month span. Do we attribute that to the gender equal battalion or to the all male battalion, right? So there are a bunch of sort of questions where we don't have the fine-grained data, and we don't have the sort of resources to really test the questions that you laid out, unfortunately. So Jeff had questions. Are there measures in place to recruit more women for these roles? Yes and no. So the UN has been making a huge push, and in particular in terms of the public media and the public relations sort of part. So the UN Peacekeeping, they have an Instagram channel, for example. And if you check that out, it's featuring, especially right now, featuring a lot of women, in leadership roles and medical roles in relation to COVID-19, obviously. So there is obviously a push to sort of highlight women and their contribution and sort of making it very visible. The problem that the UN can't really solve is that they depend on troop contributing countries. It's up to the national contingents and the national militaries to increase the number of women in their militaries. And we don't see a real push there. We see it in some countries. Sweden, Norway is doing pretty well, but others are very reluctant. And so the UN is kind of in a bind that they depend on the contributing countries, and particularly when it comes to contributing personnel, we often have European and Western nations saying, we don't really want to send our people, but we'll finance the mission. And so the actual burden of sending troops is put on global South countries. And then within these countries, we put the burden on women. So we actually have an intersectional dynamic of putting the burden not just on women, but on women from the global South. And so if we think about those dynamics of labor and who has what we're expecting of whom, it becomes really problematic. So that was a dark answer to a otherwise positive question. I'm sorry. Hannah had a question. What obstacles do women face if they wish to pursue this field? In terms of pursuing a field, pursuing this field as a peacekeeper, military. Yeah, the obstacles, I think it obviously depends from country to country, right? But unless you join the US military, obviously, even then, if you join the US military, it's unlikely you'll be sent to a peacekeeping mission because the US military is rarely sent. But there are other ways of serving for the UN as sort of as a military observer or as part of the sort of police force of the UN. Yeah, that's all right. From the structural barriers are definitely there, and I think it's particularly the sort of military culture that sort of emphasize a masculine warrior identity that just makes it really hard for women. And then in the US, we only had all combat positions, I think, opened up to women within the last couple of years. So progress has been really slow. I can probably give you more details in the next couple of weeks. We're actually about to hire an intern at the Institute who graduated from West Point and is now doing an internship, a master's at Georgetown, and becoming an intern at the Institute. And so she probably can talk to this a lot better than I can. And then I'm happy to get back to you if you have specific questions, if you're interested in that. How many UN ambassadors helped pass the initial resolution were women? I don't know. That's a good question. I could probably go back and look at who was serving on the UN Security Council back then and how many of them were women.
I guess I'm just thinking about it and being like, that's, like you said, it's kind of like good that they passed it, but they had, after that, subsequently, all these problems when they're actually looking back at it. And so it seems to be, again, one of those things that's kind of at the core of it is if people passing the resolutions, if it's all being passed by men, then it's inevitable that it's not really going to be hitting all the things that it needs to.
Yeah. And also there's definitely an institutional learning curve that even if it's women to succeed in politics, and particularly in masculine institutions like the UN, often have to adopt masculine personas and sort of have to sorry, I just saw Hannah's comment right away. It's because I have the little chat window open. And so sort of self-identifying as even as a feminist, as a woman, can be sort of harmful to you. I think, for example, Chancellor Merkel in Germany, as recently as like 3 years ago, kind of publicly didn't self-identify as a feminist, and has very much sort of throughout her career adopted sort of a masculine style, which is often necessary. So that sort of shapes resolutions and shapes structures and these sort of organs at the UN as well.
I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, you mentioned that women officials are seen as more fair and less corrupt due to certain stereotypes that are placed upon women. And I was wondering, to what extent does the inclusion of women on a police or task force alter their perception of equity and fairness within the entire group?
So within the group that the women are part of, or and whose perceptions? So perceptions of the group within itself, or outside perception of the group?
So for example, like on a police force, the inclusion of women officers, how does that affect even the perception of the other male officers in the group and the entire police force in general in the realm of more fairness and equity? And then the perception from that being like the perception of the police force from the civilians of the area, or whichever task force that would entail. Thank you.
So the example in Liberia kind of shows that the local perception of the police as an institution was that it was fairer and less corrupt because of women's participation. So there was that positive effect. What I have heard from other researchers about their work interviewing peacekeepers, and particularly male peacekeepers, is that they sort of, if you get them talking, there's the sort of official party line, and then there's their real sort of impression and feelings, and there's a big gap. So the party line is kind of, yeah, we have no problem working with women, everything's fine, everything's good. And the truth is, if you get them talking, they will be honest and say, we hate being deployed with women. And that can have a number of reasons. I think a lot of it is sort of the sort of culture aspect of they feel like they can't be themselves in their macho, masculine, militarized personalities. A lot of it might also be that there is so much attention paid to women in peacekeeping that they feel possibly neglected, and that hurts their egos. But yeah, so there's a definitely sort of there can be tensions within the group, but for locals, so far the evidence kind of suggests that it really increases their trust in policing. Margaret had a question. Yeah, West Point does a lot of training for UN forces. Who's responsible for this training? So there is gender mainstreaming and gender training for the troops. The problem there is that basically it's a 2-hour training for everyone who is deployed, sometimes before they're deployed or sometimes when they arrive at the mission. And then it's part of it's for the gender, it's the gender advisor that has to basically cram everything in a 2-hour window. And that's often for, hundreds of people. So the training is not very intense. It's not very comprehensive. And what I've heard from someone who has done gender training in the trainings in the past for the UN is that by necessity, they kind of fall back into sort of gendered patterns, and it kind of recreates certain gender stereotypes and gender dynamics simply because they only have 2 hours and they have to get certain things across. And so you can't go into an in-depth discussion of militarized masculinities and how that's harmful. Yeah, basically, long story short, the UN gender training is really compressed, way too short. They can't really go into depth because they have too many people to deal with in a short amount of time. And so they have to focus on the key issues and kind of recreate, and by necessity, thereby recreate some of the gender stereotypes themselves, unfortunately. Next question. How do you think peacekeeping missions can balance striving for greater gender equality while also not putting a disproportionate burden on women? How does the narrative around women's roles and capacities need to shift? I think the key argument is really the sort of normative argument, right? It's not about effectiveness, because actually we don't even know how effective men are, and no one's questioning that, right? What if we turned the question around and asked about the surplus deficit by all created by all male peacekeeping, right? No one's asking that question, in all honesty, but maybe we should, right? But I don't think it really brings us any closer to where we want to be. So the real step forward would be to strive for the normative argument. It's an equal opportunity approach, which is really the argument that Sabrina and Kyle put forward, that it's about changing some of the culture and what we associate with peacekeeping, and putting a greater emphasis not on sort of the warrior identity of soldiers, but sort of a more feminist approach to peacekeeping, and centering local population, their needs and their demands. And that way we can sort of say, hey, this is not about what we as sort of interveners and outsiders think should happen, but it's what the local population needs and expects and wants. And so turning the table, I think, is going to be key to that. And then we're also not putting a disproportionate burden on women, because we're basically saying, this is what we need of the mission, and we're going to create the mission in a way that it can best fulfill this function. That obviously necessitates sort of that we have a pool of male and female peacekeepers that can serve in these different functions, which at the moment we don't really have, because we don't have the pipeline from the national militaries as well. Yes, what makes gender training effective? Yeah, that'd be a great way to study it. I'm just reading Jeff's comment. I'm curious why aren't we sending all male or all female, or 25-75, 75-25, 50-50? Because it's not up to us. I mean, it'd be great if we could do that and have a very sort of structured approach and experimental approach. But because it's up to the national militaries who they send, I think there should be a push for incentivizing a more sort of equal or sort of structured approach to this, right? But the UN peacekeeping budget is already very tight, and it's going to be actually reduced for the next year. So there's just no wiggle room to do that sort of thing, unfortunately.
I do want to be mindful of people's time, and it's funny. Already it's 9 o'clock in here, and Robert, I'm obviously just so proud of what you've accomplished and being able to kind of share your story, but also so happy to see it kind of create dialogue. That was kind of the opportunity for it, and as I said before, I'm going to share Robert's email address in my kind of follow-up. We didn't talk about this before, but Robert had a interesting article that was published earlier about peacekeeping in the time of COVID, which I think is obviously especially relevant right now. But thanks for giving us the opportunity to kind of think differently and ask. I was jokingly, I was like, Robert, just make it as easy as you can, but you guys pushed him, I think, and you guys made him have to answer tough questions, which is great. And I appreciate you guys reaching out and joining us. Before I sign off, I want to make sure that you guys go onto our website and kind of see other programming. There's lots of other great programming, both in the WeSpeak series and also just general programming coming up. So I encourage you to go on the website and check out what else there is. But really, just a big thank you to Robert for sharing his time with us and sharing his expertise with us. And of course, please take care of yourselves and be healthy and stay safe during these difficult times. And we can't wait to see you back on campus or at regional events once we're over this. So thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions or advice or anything. So thank you so much.
Yep. Have a good night.